In a new book by CNN correspondent Jim Sciutto called The Madman Theory, Trump Takes on the World, Navarro suggests Canada's motive in the war in Afghanistan was to gain political points with the U.S. According to Sciutto, Navarro said every time that a Canadian shows up in a uniform, it's doing us a favor. How's that work? Were they doing us a favor, or were they brought into the idea they needed to do that as part of the global effort against terrorists? I mean, if they were just doing us a favor, maybe their government should have been thrown out of office. More than 40,000 Canadian troops served in Afghanistan over the course of 12 years. 158 of them were killed. General Rick Hillier is a former chief of defense staff and a commander of the NATO-led mission in Afghanistan back in 2004. He had this to say about Navarro's comments when he joined me earlier this week.
What an idiot. I mean, even if you believe those things, I'm not sure why you would make them and why you would disrespect the service and sacrifice and the spilling of blood and the loss of lives by Canada's sons and daughters.
For more on Navarro's comments and reaction to them, I'm joined now by Jim Sciutto himself, CNN's chief national security correspondent and author of The Madman Theory, Trump Takes on the World. Hi, Jim. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So let me start off just by asking you, if you don't mind, for a bit of a timeline. When did Peter Navarro make those comments to you?
I interviewed him for this book in January of this year. It was a lengthy conversation, nearly an hour, on a whole range of topics. And our exchange on Canada was fairly lengthy. And I pressed him repeatedly. I remind him of the service of Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan. I myself have been embedded there with U.S. troops more than a dozen times, and I always saw Canadian forces on the front lines. I pressed him on Canada, like other NATO members, invoking the NATO Charter after 9/11 in defense of the U.S. And then I pressed him. I said, listen, are you really putting Canada in a category with U.S. adversaries? Are they no better in your view than a Russia, say? And he wouldn't make a hard distinction there, which just bowled me over, I have to say. And the fact is that this is a window not into just Peter Navarro's view of U.S. allies, but really President Trump's. He has a very dismissive, at times, view of allies and an idea that allies have been taking advantage of the U.S., and he is somehow righting that balance.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get a sense from you about. Is this reflective, do you think, of the administration's attitude toward Canada?
It is, to some degree, as you remember, and I spoke about this with Navarro as well, that the president took the remarkable step of declaring Canada a national security threat to the U.S. to justify the imposition of steel tariffs, right? This is a president who will set aside, forget, dismiss decades-old alliances for the moment and cause damage to those alliances over time. Again, it's part of a bigger picture here. Look at the relationships with NATO allies today. Look at the relationship with South Korea. The president is holding the financial backing for a U.S. deployment there over South Korea's head and threatening to remove troops in the middle of its standoff with North Korea. This is part of a bigger picture. For the book, I spoke to others, including Steve Bannon. I mean, he describes several of America's relationships with some of its closest allies as a protectorate. That in his view, these allies are protectorates, almost like a 19th century sort of view of the world, that we are bankrolling them with very little acknowledgement of what the U.S., the sacrifice, the commitment, the loyalty that the U.S. gets in return for allies like Canada.
So when you put, for example, the challenges around 9/11 and Afghanistan to Navarro, what was his response?
His response was, well, were they really coming to the defense of the U.S. or were they doing this for their own interests? It's a remarkably dismissive view. I pressed him. I said, well, every country has its own interests, but they did this after America was attacked, invoking that mutual defense charter. And it doesn't move the view. And even as I said, as I reminded him of the many, more than 150 Canadian soldiers that died in Afghanistan, there's still a very one-dimensional view of these relationships. It's sort of a what have you done for me lately sort of view, which is remarkable. And I will say, it's not confined to Navarro. I spoke to more than a dozen senior advisors of the president for this book, and he has a very one-dimensional transactional view of America's alliances around the world.
He says that his comments were taken out of context in your book. What do you say to that?
Listen, I provided the full transcript of our back and forth to a CTV correspondent who did a story as well. I will happily share it with you and others. As I said, when he brought up Canada himself, I pressed him on the sacrifice of Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan, didn't move him. I pressed him on the invocation of the NATO Charter after 9/11. I pressed him to draw, as I said, a hard distinction between, I mean, you would think this would be an easy one, between Canada and Russia. And he said, well, on a continuum, yes, but would not utter the words that, yes, Canada is a dear ally of ours, to be distinguished from Russia, China, and other adversaries. So this was a lengthy conversation, and I'll happily share with CBC viewers as well the transcript of the exchange.
I wonder, I was thinking about this as I was reading those comments. There's a ton of reaction on this side of the border. Obviously, everything that has to do with our relationship, the two countries' relationship, really resonates. It's big news here in Canada every time it happens. What do you think the implications are, or how should this government govern itself? We've sort of really tried to strike a balance here, and everyone has, given, NAFTA was on the line, so much was on the line. But it certainly doesn't seem to have persuaded anybody in the White House that our intentions are anything but I guess selfish to a certain degree, based on the comments that were made to you. What are the implications here, do you think?
The implications are deep damage to some of America's oldest alliances, including its alliance with Canada. And again, in this book, I hear that analysis, that criticism from people who served the president at the highest level. His former national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, Fiona Hill, who was his top Russia advisor, Susan Gordon, who was one of the most senior intelligence officials in this country, described the long-term damage from this approach. And they also described their frustration in speaking to the president, not just Peter Navarro, but to the president himself, in trying to convince him of the importance of the alliances and all the many things that the U.S. gets out of them as well: loyalty, intelligence sharing, shared values, shared support for democracy. It is not something that easily penetrates this worldview, and it has damage. I mean, you've seen Germany's Angela Merkel or France's Emmanuel Macron say that Europe cannot rely on the U.S. as it did in the past. That is a remarkable thing to hear from some of America's closest allies, and I know Canada struggles with it as well. Listen, it doesn't mean that the relationship is ruptured completely. There's an enormous amount of cooperation that goes on, but it's fundamentally a question of trust. And I will say that, as I note in this book, some of the president's senior-most advisors talk about damage to that trust.
We played a clip a little bit earlier from Rick Hillier, who was formerly kind of the top soldier here in this country, the chief of defense staff. He advised at the end of our interview, he wanted the prime minister of this country, or the top political figures in this country, to take a more pointed approach to this and to sort of fight back in a more pointed way and specifically rebut what the president had said. Do you think that would have any resonance?
It's hard to say with this president. As you know, he has very strongly held views on a whole number of things and is often not moved, even by his relationships with close allies. In fact, in many circumstances, he pushes back, dismisses them. One phenomenon, again, that I describe in this book, but I'm sure your viewers are familiar with, is the president will often have friendlier things to say about the leaders of adversaries, say a Kim Jong-un or a Vladimir Putin, than he does about America's NATO allies or the Canadian leader. You remember Peter Navarro had his own critical comments.
Some choice words
about
there
Justin Trudeau, which I won't repeat on this broadcast. So these comments from Navarro should not be taken in isolation. They are part of a bigger picture of this administration's approach to things. And I will say that, when you speak to his advisors, and you probably read some of this in John Bolton's book as well, and in his comments, that if the president is reelected, some of these steps that were half measures in the first term become full measures in the second term. Even the discussion of withdrawing from NATO. It's a remarkable prospect to imagine.
Yeah, I was going to say Bolton's book makes it seem like NATO is the next step for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Jim, thank you so much for sharing some of your time tonight. We really appreciate it. And I look forward to the book. Jim Sciutto is the author of The Madman Theory: Trump Takes on the World. Thanks, Jim. For some more reaction to these comments from the military community south of the border, I'm joined now by retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett. He previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the administration of President George W. Bush. Hi, Brigadier General Kimmett. Great pleasure to welcome you to our program.
Thank you.
What was your initial reaction upon hearing those comments from Peter Navarro?
Well, I think initially I was a bit upset. As Rick Hillier said, he's not a soldier. He doesn't understand what soldiers do. But I think in the larger context of the challenges that we've had with Canada regarding defense budgets over the years, it doesn't surprise me. Peter Navarro is an economist. He's a politician. So from his point of view, his comments make sense.
Okay, I want to ask you about the second half of your answer there, and in particular the defense sort of relationship between the two of us, especially when it comes to defense spending. But on the first part, have you worked, with Canadian colleagues? Have you ever heard that kind of a reference to the idea that we might be doing something when it comes to working alongside our American colleagues in wars or other arenas to curry favor with the U.S.?
Well, that's not really the issue. The issue is that when we talk about militaries, when we talk about warfare, we talk about losing blood and treasure on the battlefield. Our soldiers think about the blood. The economists and the politicians think about the treasure. And it's clear that the commitments that Canada has pledged to over the years of 2% of their defense budget haven't come about. The U.S. defense budget is about 3.5% of our GDP. If we raised it or lowered it to the standards of Canada, we'd reduce our defense budget by $500 billion. And that $500 billion could go to better hospitals, could go to better infrastructure and better education. And so there is a bit of concern on the part of our American colleagues, particularly the taxpayers, that there may be a little bit of unfairness at a time when our infrastructure is crumbling.
Does that justify, though, I guess, the way in which Mr. Navarro expressed himself?
Oh, it's terrible the way he said it. And I think if he was sitting here on this interview, he'd apologize for the way he said it, but then he'd try to put it into a larger context.
So in your conversations, how frustrated are American officials? And we hear it a lot now under this administration, but we heard it under the past administration too.
Certainly.
With the level of defense spending. And what do you think the ultimate consequence might be of that?
Well, again, the NATO pledge is 2%, and Canada hasn't met that since well before 1997, when the pledge was 3%. So I think there is a concern as a taxpayer that we spend probably 20 to 30 times what the Canadian military spends, or the country of Canada spends for their defense. And that simply means more burden on my soldiers and less burden on the Canadian soldiers.
The Canadian government, in place now, and I would add contextualize it to say that prior to the pandemic, the conversation was obviously much different. All of the money discussions now focus very much on the government's response to the pandemic and what the economic recovery might look like. But prior to that, in 2017, they introduced kind of a white paper pledging to increase defense spending. They don't have it hitting 2%. I think we're at something like 1.34 right now, but they do pledge increases. I have spoken to other officials in the administration, in the U.S. administration. We've had them on the show where they say it's going in the right direction, at least. What would you say about that?
Well, what I'd say is I was in government during the 2006 Chicago conference where countries pledged to this. Canada has not come anywhere near that since 2006. It's been pledged and repledged over and over. And as your own Peter Armstrong said in a great article in 2018, this is not a military decision. This is a political decision. So when Peter Navarro says that the Americans are trying to curry favor, or the Canadians are trying to curry favor, I think he put it in the context of trying to offset the fact that the Canadian government has not met its pledges to putting that money in the defense budget. I think your soldiers would say that they could use better kit, better equipment, more soldiers. That's not a criticism, but that's an observation from the political and economic side.
Yeah,
Personally, I have great respect, and I've worked with Canadian soldiers since 1988, and they're great soldiers. There are just too few of them, and we would like to see more, because that could reduce some of the burden on the United States.
Yeah, I get the argument, and you know what? We've spoken to the defense minister here in this country multiple times and had this conversation, put these questions around defense spending to him many times. I think where it sort of rubbed people in this country the wrong way is because of what happened in Afghanistan, because we lost, a number of Canadians there, more than 150 if you include a few journalists and a few civilians as well. And I think it just sort of, I'm sure you can understand that apart from the very valid conversation about underspending on defense and accusations of that, it just sort of seemed like our contribution was being diminished by our, what we consider our closest ally in the world.
No, I think that's right. And I think, again, Peter Navarro would take back those comments and put in the broader context of ask the question, does that mean those soldiers that died were trying to curry favor with the United States? No, we're allies. We've been allies as long as I've been alive. And the death of one Canadian soldier is the same as the death of an American soldier. But we shouldn't take the comments narrowly focused as part of a belief in this country or among this administration that we diminish the contributions of Canadians on the battlefield. Your soldiers, our soldiers, we've worked shoulder to shoulder for years.
Let me ask you about that defense spending conversation as we move forward, especially in light of what I just said about the pandemic. We're facing a huge, mounting deficit in this country, so many other countries around the world, many of whom are NATO allies and also not meeting that 2% spending commitment. I'm thinking, for example, of some countries in Europe are also facing mounting deficits. What do you think that does to the conversation moving forward around defense spending? Are there going to be kind of more pressures on governments that amount to less spending on defense, do you think?
Well, I think there will be in countries that prioritize social spending over defense spending. But America does have an obligation around the world. In fact, when we talk about the threats from Russia, from China, from terrorism, I don't think anybody in this administration, and hopefully not in the next administration, are talking about cutting the defense budget. We will mortgage the future of our children to make sure that this remains a free, sovereign, and independent country, not threatened by China or Russia.
What do you think that means, though, for alliances, for that conversation on a broader level? So beyond what you expect of the United States, what do you expect the conversation to be like between the United States and its allies?
Well, I think the United States will continue to treasure its allies. It may not be as difficult a period as it is now, but look, the NATO obligations have stood. NATO has stood for 47 years. You are not only our allies, you are our friends. But at the same time, when every economy is suffering, all of us should shoulder the burdens of not only the needs of our people, but also our defense needs. And I think it would be a difficult conversation if the United States had to pick up more of the defense burden around the world because other countries were more interested in their economies than they were in national defense.
Certainly a conversation I'm sure we'll be having for a number of months after this. Thank you so much, General Kimmett. I appreciate your time and your insights this evening. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.